Hello, hi everybody. Hello, the internet. As you can tell, I am not the regular host. I'm not Matt Desmond. I'm filling in today. My name is Jason Etkovich. I work at GitHub on the special projects engineering team, where we look at all kinds of random issues and points of friction, and we try to fix them for our users. But that is not what I'm here to talk to you all about today. Today, we're going to hear from Logan Kilpatrick. So I'll give him a chance to introduce himself in just a moment. Hi, Logan. But first, I'm going to say a few words about him. So Logan he does many, many, many things, apparently. He's a full-time community manager for the Julia programming language. He's a teaching fellow for Harvard University's Extension School course, and a technical course assistant for MIT's Introduction to Computational Thinking, which sounds super cool. Also, Logan is on the board of directors at NumFocus, and I feel like that short list of things is not even like half of what Logan is actually into, which is really cool. So He's going to talk to us about how to attract non-code contributions to your open source projects. So Logan, take it away.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate the overly generous introduction.
I'm sure it's very true.
Yeah, it's a little bit generous, but nonetheless, I appreciate it. Yeah, super excited to be here. I think this is going to be a ton of fun, and I'll share a little bit about my journey making non-code open source contributions, why I think it's important, what some of the ways that open source projects can actually help facilitate some of these things, and hopefully, if there's questions that come into the comments, we'll be able to answer those questions as well.
Totally. Yes. I will be checking out the comments as well as all of the wonderful folks working on this behind the scenes. So towards the end, we'll loop back with any questions and comments. But yeah, I think with nothing else to do, take it away. You have a presentation for us.
Sweet. Awesome. Yeah. And also, Jason, I'm happy if you see anything that seems like it's a timely question or comment, feel free to jump in. Don't mind at all. I think that it'll be better than waiting until the end.
Sounds good.
Cool. Awesome. So let's talk about non-code contributions in open source. And again, I think there's a bunch of different perspectives here. There's the perspective of somebody who's, potentially making one of these contributions. And as somebody who makes a bunch of non-code contributions, I can hopefully help share that perspective. But there's also the perspective, again, from an open source maintainer or a project owner's perspective. How do we help facilitate some of these non-code contributions? Why are they important? What's the real benefit of actually, having people spend their time not committing code to your project? So we'll hopefully be able to go through all of those things. And again, if there's questions, feel free to drop it into the comments. But we're gonna begin with something really simple, and this is one of my favorite statements. And actually, I have a shirt on that says it as well. But there really is more to open source than code. There's so much more to open source than code, and hopefully, if you don't take away anything else from this presentation, hopefully that's something that you can take away. Is really don't limit your thinking about open source to code in a code base. I love GitHub. GitHub's a huge part of that, but it isn't just the code. So I think the natural next question, so then what is actually part of open source if it's not just code? Well, I think it's a bunch of different things. Some of these sort of allude to some of those points, but it's the community of people, really. I think that's sort of foundational to the open source experience. But in addition to that, it's platforms like Stack Overflow, where there's questions about code. There's it's the design pieces of an open source project that might not be, again, representative of the code itself. It's all the social media pieces that are related to the open source project, people talking about the project, people creating content, writing, blog posts, all of those things I really see as sort of foundational pieces to this open source ecosystem. And if you actually want an open source project that's going to thrive, you can't just have a really great code base. Like there really has to be all these other pieces that are part of it, which sort of build this momentum, build this community sort of around the deeply technical part of the project. So what I really like to think about, again, in the context of open source, is from a contributor's point of view, but also from a maintainer's point of view. I really see this arc of being a contributor in open source, and it starts off with things that are as simple as talking about open source, like having a conversation with someone, listening to a conversation or a presentation about open source or programming. And then that sort of transcends to things like opening your first issue and sort of making a contribution in that capacity. And then the next step after that could be something like writing a blog post or making a documentation improvement or some sort of technical writing-esque contribution in open source. And then potentially you go through and do those other three things 2 or 3 more times, 4 times, 5 times, whatever it is. And then sort of what I see as the last step in this journey of contributing to open source is the technical contribution. And why I think this is important to call out, because if you go on a GitHub repository and you look at the contributing guide for large open source projects, oftentimes the focus is entirely on, okay, how can you, make a pull request to add some code, some new feature, fix a bug, whatever it is. And I just think that, again, from my perspective, it's really important to call out the need to sort of lay out a foundation and a roadmap and a pathway for folks who, maybe aren't comfortable yet enough to go and make that technical open source contribution, but they'd like to get there at some point. And what's the path that you can give somebody who's in those shoes today? I think the path is laying out these other non-code contributions that they can make to get to the point where they're ready to make that technical contribution at some point. So hopefully that resonates with folks. Again, this is something that I feel really strongly about. Another piece, again, from a project's perspective, is to talk about, people are in the open source community for a lot of reasons. One of them is, maybe at some point somebody wants to get a job in the similar domain. And I think from a project and open source projects perspective, calling out and actually having sort of positions within the community, like the job that I have as the community manager, and now technically it's a new position title. I'm the developer community advocate. But again, that's not like even though the word developer is in it, like the whole, the job isn't about, making code contributions every single day. It's really about all of these, this wide array of contributions, some of which, can be code sometimes, but that's not the focus. And I think projects can potentially do a better job of incorporating some of these other non-developer positions into sort of the architecture and the structure of the open source project. Again, when I look at a lot of open source projects, the few that call out, like, who are the core members of the team who actually help, make this open source project what it is, a lot of times they're just, calling out sort of the core technical contributors. And sometimes there's, one or two other positions maybe that they call out. But again, I really think that there's a lot of value that can be driven in the open source space from folks who aren't necessarily the ones making those deep technical contributions. So this sort of leads to the question from a maintainer's perspective, but again, also as a user, say maybe I've convinced you that, this, okay, you're like, awesome, I'd like to make non-technical or non-code contributions. What is that actually going to do for me in this sort of journey as an open source contributor, as as somebody who's in the technical open source space? But again, also, what's that going to do for the open source community as a whole? So I think that there's, again, a bunch of benefits that are part of this process. Some of which are, one of the most important pieces about open source that oftentimes, doesn't get the recognition that it's due is the importance of communication. I think you learn this as somebody who's part of open source as a user, but then also as a contributor and as a maintainer. And I think there's sort of different lessons to be learned in all capacities of this. Again, this, you don't need to be one of the technical contributors to communicate about an open source project. You can, go write a blog post about how to do X, Y, and Z with, some specific open source project. And it doesn't, you're not inventing something new. You're sort of repackaging, an idea and sharing that with folks in a different way. And again, the reason that that's important is because it's a different perspective, and the way that you frame things might actually be the way that helps somebody who it didn't click yet, and then the way that you presented it just sort of is in the right way for that person for it to click, and then they're now able to go and finish their Hello World app in JavaScript or whatever it was. So I really think that, again, the communication piece of making non-code contributions is super important. The other part, which I think is perhaps the most compelling, is that oftentimes these non-code contributions are actually what I see as the bridges or the glue that sort of sticks an open source community together. I think if you just have sort of this technical, contributors to an open source project, again, it goes back to what I said before, where you'll eventually sort of hit the limit of, who knows about, like, you can have something really technically interesting, but if people don't know about it, if people aren't sort of talking about the project, the lifespan or the use cases are going to be more constrained than they would have to be in a normal use case. So I really think that sort of that building bridges, that connecting things together, whether it's connecting different technical pieces within the open source community, or if it's connecting people within the open source community. I think a non-code contribution could be something as simple as, hey, I want to talk to this maintainer and get their perspective on some question that I have, and then go and share that with other people in the community. Like, that's a super valuable contribution, and that's not necessarily something that's going to show up on your on your GitHub contribution activity tracker. But again, I think that it's something worth calling out and thinking about. And again, from a maintainer's perspective, how can you sort of reward and incentivize that behavior? Because again, it's providing value for the project. How can you thank the person who's doing that? What are the different mechanisms that you have available to you as that maintainer to help reinforce that behavior? And again, the last piece here is sort of broadening the scope, and we touched on that a little bit as far as getting more folks aware of the project, but also again from a contributor's point of view, really broadening the scope of your skill set. I've seen this in my own experience where I started off sort of heavier on the technical contribution side, and then over the last 2 years really transitioned to do a lot of different things. It could be design things. It could be asking questions of folks, hosting podcasts, writing about different open source technology. So really, as an individual, it can really help broaden the scope of things that you're comfortable doing and sort of operating in the technical space. I want to pause here for a sec to see if there's any questions or the like that I can answer. Oh, I think I just accidentally
but there you
something.
go. Oh, there's a question that should be on the screen now from Nate B. Do you consider the 4 steps in your arc of contribution to be linear in value? Is one more valuable than another? And how would you rank them in terms of impact?
Yeah, Nate, this is an excellent question. I'm not sure, and this, metrics and impact as far as quantifying things in the open source space is really difficult. So I'm not sure that it would be really difficult to say that one thing has more impact or value than another. I think some of them might be more difficult to measure. Like, it's difficult to measure, hey, what's the impact of somebody having a conversation about open source? But again, that conversation could transpire into somebody founding a company worth $1 billion or something. So it's really difficult to measure those things. I see them all as important steps that are part of the process.
Yeah, I really like what you said about blog posts and like external content being a way to contribute to an open source community. And I've seen so many projects sort of take off because somebody started talking about it outside of the project itself. So that's a really interesting way into making those sort of 4 steps in the arc of contribution become more valuable at certain stages of a project.
Yeah, no, that's a great point as well. I totally agree with that. I think depending on where you are, it could totally be that some of them are higher impact just because of, yeah, exactly what we said, just because of where the project is in the life cycle.
Totally.
Any other questions that were coming in that are worth answering now?
That was all of the questions that have come in so far. Oh, just kidding. There's one right now. Documentation from Ronnie. I hope I pronounced your name right. Documentation is very important in open source projects and always needed. So true. What are your opinions on this?
Yeah, and they're saying also the comment above is related, which...
There's also a comment. I actually think that non-code contributors get honored more for their contributions than non-code. Like, documentation writers are seen as less important.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, there's a really good book out there, which is called The Product is Docs. And basically the thesis of the book is that your open source project, or basically any technical software project, is just the thing that people are going to use is the documentation. So I mean, I totally agree. I think technical writers are very underappreciated. I think they're a pivotal part of the open source ecosystem, and not enough projects have the bandwidth to really leverage open source technical writers appropriately. I think that's why projects like Google Season of Docs exist, to really help raise awareness about technical writers in the open source community, and also get those expertise into projects that need them. So I totally agree that there's not enough of it happening. And I think, again, it comes down to projects incentivizing the behaviors or the contributions that they want. Like, if open source technical writers are who is of interest to an open source project, then the open source project needs to spend time thanking those people, acknowledging them on social media, and saying, like, hey, here are these things. And also, again, just as simple as it sounds, saying we need these people. People often aren't just like, if people just show up and do the work, I think you're lucky. Like, that's not like a thing that just naturally happens all the time. So just asking and saying, this is something that could provide value for the project. If you're interested, please come and we'll help you. And here are the benefits of doing this. I think that's such an important part of the process.
Totally. While we're on this topic, and feel free to loop back to it after if this is part of your future slides, but I had a question about technical writing. Have you seen any kind of like tools or integrations that you found have made contributing technical writing contributions easier, or even the flip side, like sort of raise that barrier? Because like things like CI and tests and all of those things can sometimes get in the way of non-code contributions.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In open source projects that I've been a part of, I haven't seen any really great infrastructure to sort of support things like that. I think, other than sort of the natural things like, checking for extra white space and like, but those that doesn't really help, I think, in the area that you're talking about. So yeah, I mean, one of the really small things that has been a tremendous help maintaining like a website that has technical documentation that I'm part of is using Netlify, however it's pronounced, to actually deploy previews of people's contributions. And that makes it really helpful. So especially, like a more technical context where somebody makes a bunch of changes to a website and you don't really want to download things, run them locally, or the like. It's really nice to see like a deployed preview of the website. And that from an infrastructure standpoint can be really helpful for maintainers.
Totally. Yeah. Shout out to Netlify. Their deploy previews on pull request is wonderful for that kind of thing, for sure.
Yep. And they have a great open source program too. So if you're an open source project, I literally just went through the process and applied to get our like extra, whatever it is, build minutes or something like that. So they're super great and an awesome partner in the open source space.
Nice. Cool. I think we are out of questions at the moment. There's a comment about there's not a good open source wiki documentation writing software that has a web interface. I think there's tons of opportunities for that kind of tooling, but it's another conversation. So yeah, I think we're good to continue.
Cool. Awesome. Let me see where I was. Great. So let's talk about how, again, if you're somebody who is interested in making these non-code contributions, how is it something that you can actually get started with? I think that's again, one of the biggest questions I always get from folks on social media is like, hey, I really want to contribute to open source, but it's really not clear how I can get started. So I think this is an awesome question. And let's talk about some of the things that you can do if you want to make these non-code contributions to an open source project. I think, again, the reality of open source is that maintainers are often burdened. They have a lot of things going on. They're trying to maintain this project. They might have a full-time job. So the chance of them sort of going out and making all these great resources to help onboard non-code contributions is actually is actually pretty slim. I think it's an awesome opportunity for somebody to come in and actually make this contribution from outside the community and say, hey, here are all the different ways that I've seen non-code contributions happen. And I'm going to lay the groundwork so that other people who are in the same boat as me right now can actually make these contributions. So I think as far as going through this process, reach out to people, have conversations. I think this is such an important piece. It can be really interesting to have a conversation and understand and make sure a maintainer understands, hey, what is the actual value of this? If you just throw up a PR and they're like, wait, what are you talking about? Like all these non-code ways of contributing to the project. Like, I'm not sure I really understand. I think that the PR might just sit there dormant, or it might get closed or something like that. So having the conversation before you go and, potentially propose adding a contributing guide, or even if you're, again, confused about where places are to get started, say that you need help getting started. I think that's definitely something that's acceptable. The caveat is, people are again so burdened that if you reach out to someone, you say, hey, I'd love to make a non-code contribution to this project. I'm not really sure where to get started, but if you can help me get started, I'm going to be the person who writes up how to do this, so that the next person who comes along, you don't need to spend your time doing it, talking to that person about places to get started. So I think that's such an important piece that maintainers will be really excited about, because again, their time doesn't scale as the project scales. So they need help from people reaching out and potentially offering to make these contributions. The other approach, again, is taking the permissionless approach, which is what I wrote here. Just go and do it. Like, if you want to write about an open source project and make a non-code contribution, go and make the contribution. Go and write a blog post, share it on Twitter, send it to the maintainers, tag the official Twitter account for the project, and try to sort of build awareness organically. And it's, again, the suggestion that I'll make here is, if you're providing something that's of value, in, like, for a blog post, for example, it might not be the first one that sort of gets noticed, or goes in and goes viral or something like that on Twitter. But I really do think that if you're consistently providing value in the open source community and making these contributions, people are going to notice, and that's going to open up. Not only, again, is it going to be an impactful contribution because it's providing value, but people are going to notice, and it's going to open up a ton of opportunities, and you're going to get to learn a ton. So I'm super bullish on just going and doing things and making sure that the community takes notice after that. Again, the other piece is talking to folks in the community, actually, like, getting perspectives from, maybe not like core maintainers of the project, but other users of the project. Like, hey, what are some things that you wish this project had that it doesn't have right now? Like, where are some places where the documentation is lacking? What are some, blog posts you wish were there but aren't? So the community, again, oftentimes can be a great indication, and those people are, at the end of the day, going to be the partners and those who are, sort of supporting you as you go on. Again, because the core maintainers might not scale as the project continues to grow. So hopefully this gives you a sense of what some of the things that you can actually do to get started today are. Let's talk about, again, a few other pieces. And as I mentioned before, all of these things that we've talked about are really just filling gaps in the community, building those bridges, being the glue that sort of sticks an open source project together. And again, I think these are some of the most impactful contributions that you can make in the open source space. So again, a few other pieces, and this is where we're actually going to start getting closer to talking about potentially a contributing guide. And again, this is from the perspective of a maintainer, or again, you need not be a maintainer. If you want to go and write this guide for an open source project, I think that's totally attainable. And I think there's a lot of good, hopefully I'll be able to point you to some templates out there, so that if you're interested in doing this for an open source project that you want to be a part of, or are already a part of, a good place to get started. But again, I think creating this comprehensive ecosystem contributor guide beyond just how to make a pull request, what are our guidelines for best practices and making code contributions, and highlighting these different contribution pathways, highlighting the arc of being a contributor, and literally saying it in plain English. Hey, the first time you make a contribution, it doesn't need to be a code contribution. If you're not comfortable with that yet, that's awesome. We're still happy to have you in this community, and we're still happy to help facilitate this contribution that you want to make. And then again, I think the last piece of this is, and we mentioned this already, but give recognition to these folks. If you have the ability, if you're the maintainer of a project, go in, it could be something as simple as just saying thanks. Thanks for making this contribution. It's really helpful to the project. We appreciate it. Glad to have you here. It could be literally something as simple as that. And again, it varies in scale. If you have swag, that could be an opportunity. If you have social media accounts, giving them a shout out, all that stuff is great, and sort of reinforces the sort of contributions that you want. And if folks are interested in all of these things, and this conversation has been around open source communities has been super intriguing to them, I'll give a quick plug for John O. Bacon's book. It's called The Art of, People Powered is his book. And it goes into a lot of these things about like how to build a community, what are the right incentive structures for open source projects. And John O used to be the director of communities at GitHub, actually. So it's a very relevant and timely book, but would highly suggest taking a look at that. The next piece that I wanted to share really quick was just, so again, we were talking about sort of case studies and what might something like this actually look like. So if you Google really quick, rOpenSci contributing guide, the website will come up, and this was just a quick snippet from the website that I thought was like, this really does an incredible job of highlighting the point that I've been trying to get across. And this is, again, a direct copy from their website, and I'll just read it out loud really quick. We welcome code and non-code contributions from new and seasoned coders at any career stage and in any sector. You don't have to be a developer. Maybe you want to spend 30 minutes sharing your package use case in our public forum or reporting a bug, 1 hour learning by attending a community call, 5 hours reviewing an R package submitted for open source peer review, or maybe you want to make an ongoing commitment to help maintain a package. And again, I think what's so powerful about this is that you're basically saying whoever you are, regardless of how much time or expertise or background you have in this space, there's somewhere where you can contribute. And I think, again, people want to feel that way. People want to, feel like they're part of this community and are included. I think this is such an important piece of the puzzle, of the equation to look at. The last really quick example is, again, from the rOpenSci contributing guide. And this section, again, has so much rich details. And I'll switch over to a view of the rOpenSci contributing guide in a second. But they literally have on the page, like at the top, it says, what brings you here? I want to, and then literally they list off like all the possible things that you might want to do when you stumbled upon this contributing guide. And I think it gives you permission as somebody who's coming in, again, regardless of your background, to really walk away with some actionable step of how you can contribute to this open source community. So let's actually take a really quick look at the documentation for the rOpenSci contributing guide. So it starts off looking like this, and they have all of these really interesting pieces. Let's go to the welcome section. And this is all on GitHub. So if you're an open source project and you're like, this is great, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, I would love to leverage all the work that the open source developers have done before me, awesome. The rOpenSci folks, this could pretty much verbatim be taken and leveraged in your own project. So I think, again, one of the important things that this guide does is explicitly call out what are the benefits of contributing. If you made it here, you might be intrigued already, but I think hammering home the points of why this is going to be something that benefits you as well as the entire community is a really important part of this. I think this is open for debate potentially, but I think something that I find interesting that the Julia community, which I'm part of, doesn't do in our contributing guide that the rOpenSci community does do is they actually just give some context to like what the project is as a whole, why it exists, who the people are who are involved in this project. I think that's important. That's actually something really interesting that can again provide context for why do I want to be a part of this thing? Why would I want to spend my valuable free time contributing? So I think that's part of the question and part of the equation when you're making these decisions. Yeah, so lots of good stuff. I'm going to skip down to the end and look at the next page. So this is the what brings you here, I want to page. And again, what I love about this so much is that they literally have like listed all the specific things you might want to do. And it's simple things. It's like, I want to subscribe to our newsletter. Like that's not a groundbreaking contribution even to the open source community, but it could be the first step in that path, in that journey to being a technical contributor. Getting the information you need about the community, about the ecosystem could be that first step, which is why I think it's so important that it's called out here in these contributing guides. And they have all the other things like reading the dev guide, asking questions, attending a community call, et cetera. And they've broken it down again into these different sections: discover, connect, learn, build, and then help. And I love that. I think that covers such a wide array of different people, regardless of what their background is. So the rOpenSci contributing guide was a huge inspiration when the Julia community created our sort of ecosystem contributing guide. It was very much heavily inspired from the work that the rOpenSci community did. Stephanie Butland and some of the other folks there did an incredible job. So we actually had a writer through Google Season of Docs help us with our contributing guide, and it was a super great experience. But again, calling out, again, we're hitting home on the same points, but calling out why you might want to contribute to the Julia ecosystem. What are the tools that are relevant for you to make those contributions? What do some of the different pathways to being a contributor look like? We've broken it down into, code, documentation, build versus helping people, and then explicitly gone into, hey, what are some of the different actual next steps that you can take away? Specifically contributing to a package, editing READMEs, asking questions, things like that. And then, of course, what are some of the different ways that you might be able to get help during this process? So I think this is a great place to pause. And again, both of these guides are available open source. So if you're interested in building off of them or leveraging them, you're welcome to do so. Nate B is asking in the chat, so where can I get one of these shirts?
That's a good question.
They're technically online. I think the Julia language sells them. I think you might not want this exact one because it has like the link to the contributing guide actually on the back. So if you're uninterested in the Julia community, you could probably just take the picture and print your own version.
Nice. There was another question from Nate B as well. They said, that's the second time you've mentioned fear as a barrier to contribution. Have you ever had to address this kind of sentiment directly?
That's an interesting question. I think fear is one way of putting it. I think folks are just so generally uncomfortable with I think even especially now, open source is sort of built up in this huge way that people think it's the biggest deal in the world and it's so important. And I do think it's a huge deal and it's important. But for somebody who's just making their first step, it's really difficult. Again, I get messages from people that are like, hey, I want to contribute to the Julia community. Not sure where to start. I don't I'm just beginning this journey. I'm in my first year of college or something like that. So again, I think I'm lucky enough that I get to tell these people, hey, it's awesome, so glad to have you. I think it's all the like normal things you would do when someone's worried or uncomfortable about something. Reassure them, point them to the resources so that they can be empowered to go and do things on their own terms. Those are the biggest things I would suggest.
Totally. Cool. I think just scanning the chat.
Yeah, I was looking through too.
So Nam de Plume, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, wrote a number of comments. I won't read them out in total, but basically, I think what they're saying is that there's a lot of opportunity for integration, for documentation to be sort of like a more first-class primitive in the tools that we use already. There's not really a question, but I guess how can we start to sort of consider documentation more as part of our workflows and less as like a sort of second thought, so that contributors coming along have that sort of that amount of consideration.
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think one is just saying that it's important. I think that's such an underappreciated thing, but just saying, hey, this documentation is as important to our project as making code contributions is. I think that's the first thing you can do. The second thing is I'm optimistic that, again, as was called out in the comments, that whether it's GitHub Actions or some other tools that come out in the next few years, I think that will be an important, like the Copilot, I think, is a great example of how you can, sort of potentially the next generation of writing documentation. I see all tweets all the time about people are like, I don't have to write documentation anymore because Copilot does it for me. I'm like, I'm not sure if that necessarily scales in all cases, but the sentiment is that, hey, you can use existing or some of these cutting edge tools to really help in that process. Something that I'll suggest to look at is the VS Code documentation. Actually, I think does a really good job of some of these interesting visual approaches. Like I really like the sidebar thing, and I can even share it if folks want to see.
I want to see it.
I like the way that where it is, docs. I like this little panel here on the right. It seems like such a small thing, but I think this panel right here has such a potential, and it just has like the really cool effect where as you scroll down, it changes on the right side and it has the curly brace. I think this is awesome, and I think there's so many other, like, just building on top of this idea and making that reactive or dynamic, I think could be really interesting as far as providing value in documentation.
Totally. Yeah. Ronnie also says, I need GitHub Copilot for documentation now. I totally agree, but also I have used GitHub Copilot to write documentation. It's surprisingly amazing, which is what I say every time I use Copilot. Yeah. Like, especially if you have a code example above prose that you're going to write about that code example, it does a pretty good job of describing it.
That's awesome. I actually, truthfully, I haven't tried GitHub Copilot. I've been waiting for a dark and rainy day when I have nothing else to do and I need to be amazed by something. So I'm saving it.
You will have your chance, I'm sure. Cool. I think that's all of the questions in the chat for now.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't have very much more. Again, happy to, if folks are going through the process of sort of building this for their open source project and you have questions or issues or need help, feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to the folks at rOpenSci. I think, again, they sort of inspired the work that we did in the Julia community. So yeah, definitely two resources that you can leverage to sort of begin this journey of hopefully bringing more folks into the community.
What's the best way for folks to contact you if they have any questions, comments?
Probably Twitter would be the best, easiest way to get in touch. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, then in that case, Logan, thank you so much for joining us today. That was really, really interesting. I know it's a topic I've thought a lot about, so thank you so much for sharing. I have a call to action to share with you all. So you can head over to a link that's going to be on the screen in just a moment. We want you to share your open source projects with us. Share them with the community. Let us know, let everybody know what kind of code contributions or contributions at all you're looking for, and hopefully we can send some smart folks your way.
I love that. Jason, thanks for all the work that you do. I see all the cool stuff that you're talking about and working on Twitter. So it was super great to connect today. And yeah, looking forward to chatting more in the future.
Thanks. Yeah, it was great to meet you. This is the first time we've actually met, so it's cool.
Yeah, it's fun to meet people who you like adjacently see their work on Twitter and then get a chance to chat. It's always great.
Totally. Yeah, it's one of the nice things about being part of this open source community is, all of the contributions are obviously great and important, but along the way you're making friends, you're making internet, networking buddies and all that. It's cool.
Yeah, I love it.
Cool. All right. In that case, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Logan. I will see you all next time, maybe.